She reclined in her chair, chuckled boisterously, and addressed the entire group. "He hardly gives me personal space, not to me but to everyone." We found ourselves at a lengthy dinner with her acquaintances, a gathering she enjoyed arranging during weeknights when people feigned energy. I had moved closer to share a casual remark intended for her. She subtly distanced herself and transformed my comment into a jest before I completed the sentence. Someone on the opposite side smiled, while another nodded as if understanding. The man seated across from her laughed and inserted a remark about boundaries, feeling at ease enough to expand upon her statement. I remained silent. I stayed put, then subtly withdrew my chair a few inches, making it conspicuous if anyone was observant, thus halting any further attempts at communication. The discussion proceeded without pause. She continued talking, lively and involved, but not directing her attention towards me. Dinnerware was cleared, glasses replenished. I remained silent and completed dinner ahead of time. Upon arrival of dessert, she opted for her phone rather than myself. A moment elapsed and she looked up, noticing the gap, and paused. Her hand hovered over the table for a brief instant before retracting. In the car ride home, I maintained a distance. At a traffic light, she glanced towards me as if to speak, but did not. That night, physical contact was absent, not as a gesture, merely adhering to her request. It wasn't until she realized the space was permanent that it had been established. The following morning followed its usual workday routine. I rose early, already mapping out shipments and staffing needs before my feet touched the ground. That aspect of my life thrived on order and consistency. If something malfunctioned, I repaired it. If a procedure broke down, I re-engineered it. Emotion was absent in my systems, structure was present. She moved about the apartment later than usual, engrossed in her phone, only partially engaged. She spoke of a dinner from that evening, delivered it as a casual calendar note rather than an invitation. I gave a nod and mentioned my tardiness truthfully. The day at work swiftly filled up with vendors phoning, a truck delayed, a request for coverage from a supervisor. Busy on purpose, I ignored my phone lying face down, didn't check if she'd texted. As the day concluded, I didn't hasten home. Instead, I stopped at a tranquil eatery nearby the warehouse and remained there longer than necessary. She inquired once about my return time. I responded belatedly with a brief message stating that I was detained. No further questions were asked, no emojis exchanged. In the following days, I maintained my pace. I didn't sit beside her on the couch nor across any spaces. When she discussed work matters, I listened attentively without showing interest. When she chuckled at something on her phone, I remained stationary. She showed no immediate reaction. At first, it appeared she felt relieved. Less burdened, as if the tension she had vocalized was now released. She behaved more at ease, spoke candidly about meals and meetings, often slipping in the same name, always in a professional context, accompanied by a grin. Unbeknownst to her, I ceased molding myself around her timetable. I no longer waited for an opportunity. Instead, I preserved the distance she requested. For some time, this altered setup seemed to fit her well. The distance remained as she desired, and she eased into it comfortably. She stayed later after work hours. Evenings morphed into drinks. Drinks led to anecdotes she shared casually, usually while standing on the move towards the next activity. I ceased inquiring, neither with pointed nor casual queries. Upon her mentioning another late gathering, I gave a nod and declared prior engagements. When she suggested we meet properly over the weekend, I glanced at my schedule and replied I was uncertain. At home, I moved silently without announcing myself. I chose the chair opposite the table rather than the one next to her. In the car, I drove without breaking the silence. If she leaned towards the window, I maintained my position behind the wheel. It wasn't chilly, it was precise. She continued to regard my presence as inevitable. She believed I'd appear at some point, once things became less hectic. She mentioned a future dinner with friends and suggested it would be beneficial for us to reappear together. I responded that I might drop by, contingent upon the week's progress. This reply seemed sufficient for her. It left room for possibility without making any promises. She appreciated this. It allowed her to preserve the storyline. While this was happening, I began dismantling small shared routines. I canceled a few joint memberships and didn't renew them. I split the groceries into separate accounts for delivery. I shifted my funds subtly, not all at once, merely enough to establish independence. She failed to perceive the change. Perhaps she perceived the silence and thought it was transient, much like how she believed the rift would heal naturally. From her perspective, nothing drastic had transpired. She requested space, which I granted without objection. However, what she failed to realize was how effortless it had become for me to live that way. The initial hint that something was amiss emerged when she began noticing the quiet. One night, she halted in the doorway and inquired if I was upset about something. Though her question seemed casual, as if checking the weather, she lingered longer than necessary, waiting for a response. I replied that I was well and resumed my activities. She hesitated for a moment before departing the room. Since then, her focus intensified. She began to frequently incorporate my name into her conversations about plans, integrating me into stories in which I hadn't consented to participate. She'd suggest it would be pleasant if I dropped by for a while, or that people were inquiring about my whereabouts. I evaded a direct response, a tactic I often employ when work-related variables remain unclear. At a casual get-together about a week later, I chose to arrive alone and depart ahead of schedule. Upon spotting me, she didn't sit beside me. Instead, I found myself seated on the opposite side of the room, conversing with colleagues from logistics and supply who favored discussing figures and deadlines. As I prepared to depart, I nodded at her and exited without lingering. She approached me by the door and inquired about my destination. I mentioned an early morning and left. She watched me go, then re-entered the venue alone. That evening, she texted past midnight, inquiring if I was returning home. I responded the next day, stating I'd stayed near work. No explanation given, no apology offered. The dynamic was gradually changing now. The space she had requested was no longer something she could easily enter and exit. It was constant, unyielding. For the first time, she began to adapt to it rather than vice versa. She felt our silence might become conspicuous, so suggested a conversation to bridge the gap. She chose a moment convenient for her, mid-afternoon amidst meetings, presenting it as a reboot. It wasn't emotional, rather practical. She observed we hadn't connected in a while and catching up could be beneficial. I concurred, meeting at the location she proposed. She started the conversation, filling it with work updates and mentions of mutual acquaintances, seemingly aiming to restore familiarity. She hinted at an upcoming dinner with friends and suggested our presence would be advantageous. There was a casual tone in her words. When she eventually asked about my well-being, I informed her I was merely respecting the distance she requested. I kept my voice neutral, devoid of accusation. It was only then that she smiled, clarifying her intentions. She admitted she hadn't meant to keep her distance. She stated I was reading too much into her remark. She admitted that intimacy had been complex for me, and I often overcompensated. She also stated that she didn't require me to vanish just because she needed space. She didn't demand proximity. Instead, she asked for better self-management from me. After she finished speaking, I acknowledged her words. I told her I understood and decided to maintain the status quo temporarily. I got up, wished her good night, and departed without revisiting the strategy she had proposed. That evening, I closed our shared account, transferring my share into my own. I didn't hasten it or make a spectacle. I simply completed what I'd begun. I packed a few additional items while she was absent and left the remainder untouched. The error wasn't in her words, but in her ease of expression. From then on, there was nothing more to clarify. The distance was no longer temporary. After that discussion, I stopped being readily accessible in ways she had always depended on. I continued to respond to messages, but not instantly. Occasionally, I attended work functions, but on my own conditions, not lingering beyond necessity. I didn't overstay or wait idly. I departed before events became socially demanding. Initially, she attempted to reintegrate me into her routine as usual, sending invitations presuming I would eventually comply. When I declined, the communications altered. The messages became terse, and the intervals between them shortened. One evening, she inquired about my return home. I replied that I had an early schedule and was near the warehouse. The subsequent night, she made no such query. By week's end, she started checking my whereabouts before arranging plans rather than vice versa. At a modest professional dinner she hosted, I arrived late and sat at the opposite end of the table. I stayed until the main course was finished and departed prior to dessert. She observed me rise, hesitated as if on the verge of joining, then resumed her conversation across from her. It was then that I observed how effortlessly another figure filled the void I'd left behind. The same man she often mentioned during work dinners, displaying an air of assurance and comfort among those present. He conversed as she did, shared her laughter, and remained unaffected by my departure. She didn't introduce him. It was unnecessary. By the time I reached my car, I had 3 unanswered calls. I chose not to respond. I drove until the city dwindled, then checked into the same lodging I'd been using throughout the week. The tension wasn't palpable, yet it was perceptible. It didn't need to be overt. Everything was unfolding as it was destined to, and neither of us were pretending otherwise anymore. From that moment on, the distance became something she could no longer joke about. It manifested in various ways. her reaching for me in public only to find nothing there, entering rooms alone where people expected our presence together, and my name disappearing from her narratives. Maintained my daily schedule with work days extending and weekends filling spontaneously, replying to her late messages in the morning hours, answering questions about location vaguely. At work, busy over the weekend, away for a night, all facts, not topics for further conversation, attempted to pull me closer in subtle ways. A text about a dinner reservation for two, a reminder of an upcoming gathering with friends, a comment on the oddity of no longer sitting together. I responded to each without altering the status quo. At social gatherings, the change was palpable, made brief appearances or skipped them altogether. When present, avoided sitting next to her, stepped back in photos, no longer filling the role she had grown accustomed to leaning on. Others began asking casual questions I couldn't evade easily, not dramatic questions, basic ones, about my whereabouts, if everything was all right. She responded with a smile and continued moving forward. She lost the cushion my presence once offered. Without my presence to fill the void, gazes lingered excessively. Every departure seemed deliberate. The man who previously remained inconspicuous no longer needed to hide. He was present upon her arrival and lingered as others departed. The impact of my withdrawal wasn't abrupt or apparent. It accumulated subtly, in front of people attuned to patterns. Once the pattern emerged, it ceased being a misinterpretation. The dinner that revealed everything wasn't intended to be eventful. It was one of her routine social gatherings, a lengthy table at a familiar eatery. Friends from her circle intermingled with unfamiliar faces. I mentioned I would visit. I didn't specify when or for how long. Upon my arrival, the seat next to her remained vacant, not reserved, just empty. She looked up, recognized me, and smiled in relief that waned when I failed to approach it. I moved a chair a few seats apart, nodded at acquaintances, finding my spot as if it were predestined. The discourse circulated, encompassing work anecdotes, travel plans, and future ventures. She subtly inclined towards me once, gauging whether the gap had diminished. I remained static. Upon the arrival of the server, I ordered promptly and focused on my food. Someone inquired if there were tensions between us, not accusatory, almost courteous. She responded before I could, stating we'd been preoccupied lately, and forced a chuckle. The laughter sounded hollow. No one reacted. Midway through the meal, I glanced at my watch and rose. I expressed an early start tomorrow and thanked the host. Some showed surprise. She appeared puzzled, then regained composure. As I departed, the man opposite her slid into the vacant spot. He leaned in, resumed the dialogue, and stayed there, close enough to be noticeable, comfortable enough to seem permanent. I didn't look back. By dessert time, the question of who should be by her side was no longer hypothetical. The answer had been made clear in front of everyone. She didn't make contact that night, not during dessert service, not as people began to depart, nor even later when she typically called to readjust the mood and feign normalcy. The silence extended beyond the norm, and that spoke volumes. The following day, her name appeared on my screen once. A call in mid-afternoon. I did not pick up. A message ensued, cautiously composed, suggesting we needed to talk soon, as things were taking a specific direction, and she disliked how quickly assumptions were being made. I remained unresponsive. However, what reached me wasn't her response. It was information from a coworker about seeing her again at another dinner, seated alongside the same man, their dialogue fluid and unbroken. She inquired if we remained a couple, only to correct herself before my response. It seemed she was aware of the change already. She believed distance could be managed and modified as needed, coming closer when required. However, she hadn't anticipated that sustained distance would lead others to draw their own conclusions. By the time she attempted to clarify matters, there was little left to explain. No quarrel led to our separation. No dramatic scene forced a decision. I had simply adhered to her request without deviation or follow-up. Meanwhile, as she elaborated and qualified her words, the space next to her had already been occupied by someone who didn't require permission. The transformation wasn't in our legal union, but rather who the world now perceived as standing beside her. This shift was irreversible without returning to a position I no longer held. We never discussed or defined what transpired between us. The final discussion never occurred, leaving our marriage in a state of legal limbo, much like an abandoned contract. Our interactions shrank to practical matters, exchanging brief messages about mail, documents needing signatures, and scheduling visits to avoid coinciding. She ceased asking about my whereabouts, while I stopped extending unnecessary gestures. In public, the illusion returned swiftly. She no longer came alone, but the man from her professional circle was a constant presence, evident enough that his role was obvious to others. Society accommodated without comment. Invitations omitted my name. When encountering me and inquiring about her well-being, they did so with familiarity, as if they already knew the answer. I maintained the space she had set for me. At social functions, I either stayed on the periphery or did not attend at all. If we encountered, we politely acknowledged and carried on separately. A purposeful distance, reminiscent of a previous joke at a dinner, always marked our interactions. No volatile event sealed the separation. The chasm grew naturally. She secured the desired space. I ceased occupying it. When it was apparent that reconciliation wasn't an option anymore, no further explanation was required. Her space flourished while mine lay vacant by design. And thus, the chapter concluded not through a quarrel, but with a distance that eventually became non-negotiable. The tale reaches its end here, yet the discourse is just commencing. Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated.